Welcome to our final history lecture of the year. I know it's hard to believe that the year's already done, and certainly this year did not look like I think any of us were expecting it to look. But yet, here we are, the end of another year. Hopefully you've enjoyed learning about United States history and the role the United States has played in the world. And unfortunately, today, we're kind of ending on a negative note. Certainly from a political perspective, this is a negative event that we're talking about today, and that is the Watergate scandal, probably the most famous American political controversy of the 20th century, and also probably the most difficult to understand from a exactly what happened perspective. There are even still some questions about exactly how involved President Nixon was in the cover-up of this event and what happened, although certainly he was aware of it and was responsible for at least trying to cover it up. But there's also questions out there about whether he's actually responsible for the event itself, which we'll talk about briefly. So to start off with, we need to discuss who Richard Nixon is. Richard Nixon was a representative and then senator who served the state of California. Nixon had really risen to prominence in American politics under Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy, who we've mentioned very briefly before, was the famous senator from Wisconsin who really rose politically by accusing other government officials of being communists. This is sometimes called one of the two Red Scares of American history, the first happening after World War I, this one happening after World War II. What McCarthy would do is he would select people and he would say, I have information that proves they are connected to the Communist Party and that they do not have America's best interests at mind. And oftentimes people would ask him to put out these lists. He would claim to have lists of people and he would never put them out, and he would make all of these accusations. Nixon kind of rode on McCarthy's coattails. McCarthy eventually kind of went down in flames for accusing the army of also having communist sympathizers inside of it. Fortunately for Nixon, he did not follow McCarthy along with that. And so that kind of forced Nixon to emerge onto the national stage. He was a diehard Republican, and I don't mean conservative, I mean Republican. He was a party man. And this shouldn't surprise us, but he was selected as the party hatchet man for Eisenhower. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was a general, very uninvolved politically while he was a general. And by the way, I think that's probably a correct position to have when you are serving as the military side of the U.S. government. But once Eisenhower left the military, there was really quite a question about which party he was going to join. And both parties were pushing Nixon to run for them. Excuse me, not Nixon, Eisenhower. And Eisenhower eventually selected the Republicans. And so the Republicans planned to run Eisenhower, but they chose Nixon as the kind of backup to Eisenhower and the actual Republican representative of the Republican Party in government. And the intention was that Eisenhower would kind of be the face and Richard Nixon would do all the dirty work in the back. In reality, Eisenhower and Nixon do not appear to have gotten along particularly well. In fact, Eisenhower in many ways kept Nixon in the background for most of his presidency. So I don't think this was effective, and I think oftentimes when the party puts in a vice president they hope is going to actually kind of call the shots, this doesn't work out very well. I believe this also occurred with Lyndon B. Johnson and JFK. The only way that Lyndon B. Johnson really got to emerge as his own political force was because of JFK's assassination. So this usually does not work out as well as people think it does, and so Nixon is not going to accomplish a lot under Eisenhower, although he was the presumed next Republican nominee. And so in 1960, he is the one on the ballot blocks for the Republican Party, and much to everyone's surprise, he is narrowly defeated by John Frederick Kennedy. We've talked about Kennedy briefly before, but I think it would be relevant to review why this was so surprising. Number one, remember that JFK did not himself possess, in my opinion, super great leadership potential. Many of his decisions were made for him by others. Certainly his decision to run for president even was kind of orchestrated by his own father, who was on the record saying that he was going to make at least one of his sons president of the United States. JFK was also a Catholic, and traditionally in American politics, being a Catholic was a very quick way not to get yourself elected, because most American voters, even at this time, were Protestant and did not like Catholics. So to everyone's surprise, JFK, despite the fact that he was a winning personality, had a lot of things going against him, defeated Nixon in the presidential race. And many people think that's because Nixon was just unlikable, but that actually isn't true. Nixon had gone on public record, on the television, on radio several times during the Eisenhower administration, and he actually polled quite well. Most people thought that Nixon was a pretty good guy. He was a pretty good politician. He had kind of this dry wit that many people liked a lot. Once asked if he was taking any campaign contributions and basically stealing the money, he said, "I have never taken any money, but I did accept a dog once," and he had the little Cocker Spaniel with him, and that melted a lot of people's hearts and said, "Oh, look, he's such a nice guy. He got a dog for his kids while working as a politician, and he's poor." Okay, not really poor, but poor compared to some other politicians. That's kind of the idea. So Nixon is defeated, and he goes back and he attempts to win the governorship of California, is defeated in that. And for many politicians, that would be the end of the story. A double defeat in election oftentimes ends political careers, but sometimes that is not the case. That was not the case for James K. Polk. That is not the case for Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon does not run in 1964, but he is still a leading Republican. The Republican candidate that is run is Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater was a very unique Republican, to say the least, had some interesting ideas, did not motivate the Republican base to get out and vote, and rather than even come close to defeating Lyndon B. Johnson, he was defeated in a landslide election, and Lyndon B. Johnson easily took the presidency. And Nixon had not really signed off on Barry Goldwater's ideas, and so he was kind of left as the strongest potential future candidate to many Republicans. And so in 1968, Nixon was able to run, and this time he was able to win, and won quite handily because Lyndon B. Johnson was deeply unpopular as a president for several reasons. Now, we've talked, by the point that you're probably watching this, about the Vietnam War and the incredible public outcry that was occurring because of the war. We've talked about the Kent State Massacre, and we've talked about all of the pushback by the American public on the Vietnam War. And remember, as the Vietnam War began to involve more and more men, Lyndon B. Johnson had turned to a draft, and this draft was primarily pulling low-income people into the war, making it even more unpopular. It seemed like a rich man's fight and a poor man's war. That was kind of the idea, or excuse me, a poor man's fight, rich man's war. The idea being that the rich were benefiting from it and the poor were the ones actually fighting and dying for the war. Nixon campaigned on a strong anti-war ticket, actually. He intended to withdraw as many American troops from the war as he could, and instead leave the fighting primarily up to the South Vietnamese, which, by the way, and we mentioned this briefly in the Vietnam lecture itself, he was successful at doing. In fact, between 1968 or 69 when he took office, and 1975, the United States did withdraw almost all of their troops out of the war. The issue was that it was not fast enough for most people. So Nixon actually did fulfill his promise. He was pulling Americans out, but not as quickly as many people expected him to do. But that being said, none of that was known in 1968, and so Nixon won very handily for making promises to get out of the war. And again, the Democrats were deeply unpopular. Lyndon B. Johnson and whoever his chosen successor were deeply unpopular with most Americans. Now, that being said, when Nixon arrived in the White House, he was in many ways a very moderate Republican. In fact, if you look at the policies of Richard Nixon, many of them resemble that of a Democrat more than they resemble that of a modern Republican. And there's two reasons for this. Number one, Nixon had always been a moderate for most of his life. I don't think he had very many strictly held political opinions. He was simply a Republican. That was his party, and whatever was going on, he was comfortable with. And number two, Nixon had a completely Democratic Senate and House of Representatives. So even had Nixon wanted to reverse many of the bad things that Lyndon B. Johnson had done, and I'm letting my bias get in the way there. Some people, I'm sure, respect Lyndon B. Johnson, but certainly not me. I don't think Nixon could have changed it anyway. So he kind of just went with the flow and allowed the Senate and the House to continue to do things. Of note, particularly to us, during Nixon's second term, the Roe versus Wade decision was made, which in my opinion is one of the worst court decisions made of all time. and has been responsible for the death of millions of unborn children. So it should be pointed out that this happened during Nixon's presidency, a Republican presidency, sandwiched between Democratic presidencies, but it's oftentimes missed that this did occur under Richard Nixon. And I think Richard Nixon does bear a little bit of the blame for that. Again, not much he could have done against the Supreme Court, but the general liberalism of the United States did not diminish under him. In fact, we don't see a conservative reaction to the liberal policies initiated by Lyndon B. Johnson until the Ronald Reagan era. Now, let's get to what Nixon is most controversial for, and that is the Watergate scandal. First, let me preface everything by saying this, that the 1972 election was one of the least eventful elections in all of U.S. history. Richard Nixon won in a massive landslide, easily beating George McGovern, the Democratic candidate from South Dakota, and beating him in nearly every state. Nixon was immensely popular, and the Democratic nomination process and the Democratic candidate were incredibly weak. And so Nixon won the election handily. And to add to the pointlessness of the Watergate affair, he also cheated to win. All right? He did not need to cheat. In fact, one famous political commentator said that almost any Republican ever would have loved to run against George McGovern. In other words, the Democratic candidate was so bad that basically anybody could have beat him. Literally, a Republican body in the race would have won George McGovern at his best. And yet, for some reason, Nixon chose to cheat. Or his friends chose to cheat for him. And that is the real difficulty of the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal itself is actually fact. Okay, the Watergate event is well known, and 5 guys who were part of an organization called CREEP, bad acronym, but it stood for Committee to Re-elect the President, broke into the Watergate complex. The Watergate complex was a large office building that housed the Democratic National Convention. And what these 5 men did was they began bugging all of the rooms used by the Democratic National Convention. The idea being they could listen in to conversations that the Democrats were having and use this information in some way in their campaigns. The problem is these guys were not exactly the world's best criminals. Let's just put it that way. The entire plot was discovered when the 5 men had broken in and they had taped over many of the door locks. And a security guard walked through and thought to himself, this simply must be a staffer trying to get back in, but I can't have them violating security, so he removed all the tape. And the guys noticed this, and rather than realize that, hey, there's someone checking these doors, they retaped all of them. And the security guard walked around again, noticed that several of the doors he had removed tape from had the tape put back on, realized that that was very suspicious, called the cops, and these 5 guys were arrested. The question that quickly came up is, are these guys actually connected to the president himself? Again, this committee to re-elect the president was kind of a shadowy organization, and it took time to trace these gentlemen to that organization. And then the question was, is this simply an organization that is run without any of Nixon's knowledge, or is Nixon actually part of this organization as well? When this event first came out, and it really hit national headlines after the election was already over and Nixon was guaranteed to have another term, Nixon was in a really tough position, because he, as president, to look good, really needed to pursue this case and prove that these guys had been acting on their own. The problem is that Nixon was informed of the break-in and the arrest of these men less than a day after it happened. In fact, it came out very clearly that Nixon was aware of what was happening, and the reason that it came out that Nixon was aware of what was happening was a very interesting and egotistic thing that Nixon, and for the record, Lyndon B. Johnson, had done, and that is that they recorded many of their conversations in the Oval Office and other places. Lyndon B. Johnson, and then later Nixon, had installed recording devices in their desks so that when they were discussing things, they could record them for the benefit of future historians. For example, Nixon specifically had his recorders installed so that everyone could see that he had taken the correct policy line on Vietnam. The problem is that eventually knowledge of these recordings and the fact that there was a recorder got out to the Senate committee that was investigating these break-ins, which were finding more and more money connections to the committee to re-elect the president, and it became clearer and clearer that many of Nixon's campaign aides and many of his aides in the White House itself were also connected to this organization. So Nixon himself was not a member of the organization, but many of his associates were connected to this organization. Once they realized that there were in fact tapes, the Senate and the House of Representatives subpoenaed Nixon and asked for the tapes. And the president attempted to block this by citing executive privilege. Effectively, what he stated is that those tapes are matters of national security and therefore cannot be given over while they are discussing relevant things. And this defense largely fails because the Senate points out that there shouldn't be any national security concerns that he has been recording that they cannot have access to in some way, shape, or form. Nixon attempts to stymie the request for the tapes once he kind of gets wind that he's going to lose this executive privilege exemption by releasing transcripts of what's on the tapes. But it's very apparent that the transcript of what's on the tapes is incomplete. There are sections missing that really probably contain all of the juiciest stuff. And the Senate then requisitions the actual tapes themselves. The transcripts aren't good enough. You have to turn over the actual recordings. While the recordings are being turned over, Nixon's secretary, who was responsible for doing much of the actual physical recording itself, she had to click the recorder on and off from her desk, claimed that she had a delete footage or delete audio function in her foot control panel. The secretary had a foot control panel where she could hang up the phone and she could transfer calls and start recordings from a foot panel. And she claimed that she had accidentally deleted while transferring the files over to the Senate and to the House of Representatives. She'd accidentally deleted 18 minutes of the files. And those 18 minutes of the files have led to a number of conspiracy theories, and many people believe that Richard Nixon specifically incriminated himself in those 18 minutes. He'd actually maybe even ordered the break-in to the Democratic National Convention. Well, even without those 18 minutes, the damage to Nixon was immense. Let's talk about the two aspects in which Nixon was damaged. Number one, let's talk about the release of the transcripts. The release of the transcripts badly damaged Nixon's public appearance and public record, because what many Americans did not realize is that Nixon had somewhat of a foul mouth. And I know, unfortunately, in today's modern society, you cannot go very far without dealing with bad language. We find it in books that are supposed to be academic. We find it in movies that are designed for kids and even teenagers. We find it in our television shows. We find it in our YouTube channels. So today, expletives and bad language is unsurprising to us, and I think that's rather unfortunate that that is the case. But back in the 1970s, harsh language and especially swear words or even racial slurs were not expected out of your politicians. Not at all. Today, again, we have unfortunately fallen away from that. Many of our elected officials are willing to swear on national television if it suits their purposes, and unfortunately that's on both sides of the aisle. But this was not common in 1970. The transcripts were filled of blanked out words which said expletive deleted, and it quickly showed a picture of Nixon that was very angry and very prone to swearing when under pressure. In addition to this, the transcript certainly showed that the president was aware of some event that occurred at the Democratic National Convention, although everything in the transcript indicated that Nixon only knew about the events after the stories hit the national news. With the actual recordings in hand, it became very clear that Nixon knew about the break-in almost the night it occurred, and that he had helped with a cover-up. In fact, it becomes very clear that all 5 men had been bribed by Nixon's personal associates to stay quiet and attempt to hide their connection with the president's campaign. Now, this bribery campaign had failed, and several of Nixon's close associates had even begun to work with the press, but this made it clear that Nixon had not only known about this from the beginning, but had not been forthright with both the Senate and the House of Representatives when they had asked him a number of questions, and it was even possible that he had perjured himself. With this information in hand, Senate and House of Representatives leaders came and met with Nixon, and Republican leaders who could have prevented a conviction in an impeachment trial warned Nixon that they would have to vote based on the evidence, and that all of the evidence available to them at that time pointed towards his wrongdoing. Because of this, Nixon felt it was necessary to resign from the presidency, which he did in 1975. This was unprecedented. We have had presidencies end because of assassinations, and you're familiar with several of those, but never before had we had a president not serve his entire term due to a resignation. In fact, there were several questions about whether resignations were even legal. Could the president resign? And I suppose the answer to that question now is yes, but that was not known when President Nixon did that. Now, who took over for Nixon? Well, it wasn't his original vice president. His original vice president had turned out to have had real corruption problems when he had been governor of Maryland, and so Nixon had selected, after the ousting of his first vice president, a man by the name of Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was a representative from Michigan, and in fact, he is the only president from Michigan. He's not related to the Ford family, although that is ironic. And unfortunately for Gerald Ford, his presidency, his name kind of went down in infamy because he is mostly well known for the fact that he pardoned Nixon. Upon Nixon's resignation and leaving of the White House, Ford declared that it would be best for the country if he pardoned Nixon. There was a real question about whether Nixon could even be tried for what he had done after he left the presidency, and so Ford attempted to deal with this problem by pardoning Nixon. And to many, that made Nixon appear even more guilty, and it made it appear that Ford was somehow involved. He was not. Ford was actually a Nixon White House outsider. He did not have close connections to the president, and he was selected primarily for that reason, actually. Anybody closely associated with Nixon was in hot water, and so he was selected because he was not close to Nixon, but many people thought that Gerald Ford was dishonest because of this. And in 1976, Gerald Ford versus Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford is defeated in a landslide by Jimmy Carter, a Democrat from Georgia. With that, we are going to end our recorded lectures of American history. There's many more things that happened. We can't even touch on the presidency of Jimmy Carter, of Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, Obama, and of course President Trump. Normally, in a normal year, we would actually end in the 1990s. I'd like to keep away from anything that happened in the last 20 years. Those events are still shaping up and happening. In our last in-person lecture, we will cover the one 21st century event that I think all Americans need to be familiar with, and that is 9/11. So if you're wondering where that is, don't worry. We will talk about that in person very soon, or we might have already talked about it by the time you're watching this. With all of that said, hopefully you do well on finals next week. Thank you for being attentive history students, and I will see you next year.